Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are taking a look at 20 everyday habits that could be secretly affecting your happiness. And we're not necessarily talking about huge life-altering habits, but those small things that we often do without even realizing the impact they might be having on our mental well-being.
Yeah. And it's amazing because there's been a lot of research lately really kind of compiling and looking at all these habits and even quantifying their effects in some cases. And it goes beyond just feeling off. Some of these habits can actually increase our risk for some serious stuff like depression and anxiety.
Okay, so no pressure then. Let's just jump right into it. First up, sleep. We all know that sleep is important. But what specifically is the connection to our mood?
It's interesting. Think of your brain as this really intricate system for regulating emotions. And when you are constantly getting poor sleep, even just having an irregular sleep pattern, it's kind of like throwing a wrench in that system. The study we're looking at here, it actually found that people who are sleeping less than 5 hours a night, they're significantly more likely to experience those depressive symptoms, which is pretty crazy.
5 hours, wow. I've definitely been there. So beyond aiming for the recommended 7 to 9 hours, what are some things that we can do to improve our sleep hygiene?
So one of the biggest things is consistency. Having a regular sleep schedule, even on the weekends, helps regulate your natural sleep-wake cycle. And this might seem obvious, but think like a cave. Dark, quiet, and cool are ideal for good sleep. But here's where it gets interesting. It's all about that pre-sleep routine. That's really key.
Yeah, I am so guilty of the late night scrolling.
The thing is, that blue light from our devices can actually delay sleep onset. And, research suggests that the same goes for eating heavy meals close to bedtime.
Okay, so maybe swap that late night scroll for a book and ditch the midnight snack, eh?
Exactly. Having a calming routine, it basically sends a signal to your body that it's time to wind down. Taking a warm bath, sipping some herbal tea, even light stretching, all these things can make a difference.
Okay, I am already feeling more relaxed just thinking about that.
Eh.
Okay, moving on. We tackled sleep. Let's talk about movement, or rather, the lack thereof. A sedentary lifestyle.
Hmm.
It's not just bad for our physical health, right?
No, not at all. A sedentary lifestyle has been seriously linked to poorer mental well-being. And the research is so fascinating because it's not just showing a correlation, it actually suggests a causal link between physical inactivity and depression.
Wait a second. So sitting around too much could actually cause depression. So how does that even work?
Basically, when we're inactive, our brains produce fewer endorphins, which are the chemicals that actually make us feel good. But on top of that, our bodies become less resilient to stress.
So it's not just about missing out on a runner's high. It's that our brains and our bodies literally aren't getting what they need to cope with the everyday challenges that we're facing.
Exactly. Even moderate exercise can have a huge impact. And it does that by releasing those mood-boosting neurotransmitters and helping regulate those stress hormones.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? How much exercise do we actually need to be getting to kind of combat this?
Well, the general guideline is at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic activity per week.
So that could be anything from a brisk walk to a dance class.
Absolutely. And remember, it doesn't need to be all at once. Even short bursts of activity throughout the day can make a difference, especially if you have a job where you're sitting a lot.
And I think finding something that you actually enjoy is key. Because if it feels like a chore, you're less likely to stick with it.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, whether it's dancing or yoga, swimming, hiking. The point is to find something that brings you joy and motivates you to get moving.
Okay, so we've covered sleep, we've covered exercise. Let's talk about another big one, food. Is there really a connection between what we eat and how we feel?
You bet there is. And the research is actually really compelling here. There have been studies that have found a connection between diets that are high in ultra-processed foods and an increased risk of depression.
Say it ain't so. So those cravings for chips and sugary treats, they're doing more than just expanding our waistlines.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, think about it. Ultra-processed foods. They're loaded with sugar, unhealthy fats, artificial ingredients, and they lack a lot of the nutrients our brains need to function well.
Okay, so what's the solution here? Depriving ourselves completely doesn't sound super sustainable or, frankly, fun.
Right. It's about finding a balance and kind of making small, gradual shifts towards a more wholesome diet. Think fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean protein, all the good stuff.
Okay, so instead of reaching for that bag of chips, maybe try some fruit or a handful of nuts.
Exactly. Little swaps like that can make a world of difference. And don't forget about staying hydrated. Even mild dehydration can impact our mood and our cognitive function.
Water is our friend, duly noted.
Hmm.
Any other tips for improving our eating habits?
Well, one thing the research highlights is mindful eating. So it's about slowing down, savoring each bite, and paying attention to those hunger and fullness cues from our body.
Okay, so it's not just about what we're eating, but also about how we're eating. Makes sense. All right, moving on to habit number 4, and this one can be a bit tricky because it often feels like a stress reliever in the moment. Alcohol.
Alcohol. So yeah, it might seem to ease tension at first, but the research is pretty clear that if you're drinking heavily or frequently, it's linked to increased rates of both depression and anxiety.
So that wind down at the end of a long day could actually be setting us up for a mood slump later on.
It's possible, yeah. Alcohol is a depressant, and it can actually make anxiety worse over time. It disrupts sleep,
Huh.
and it depletes those essential neurotransmitters that we were talking about before.
Yikes. Okay, so is there like a safe amount that we can drink without impacting our mental health?
Well, the general guidelines suggest no more than 1 drink per day for women and 2 drinks per day for men. But I think it's important to remember that everyone's different. Your individual response to alcohol and any pre-existing mental health conditions should always be considered.
So awareness, moderation, and maybe finding some healthier ways to unwind,
Mhm.
like exercise, spending time in nature, or even those calming pre-sleep routines that we talked about.
Absolutely. Now, let's shift gears a little bit to another habit that's kind of intertwined with mental health:
Yeah.
smoking.
This is one that a lot of people struggle with, and I know it can be incredibly hard to quit. But what's the connection between smoking and mental well-being?
It's complex. While nicotine might provide a temporary sense of calm, for long-term smokers, they actually tend to experience higher levels of stress and anxiety, and they have an increased risk for depression.
Oh, it's like a vicious cycle. We reach for cigarettes to try and cope with the stress, but then they actually make the problem worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more you smoke, the greater that risk. And that's what we call a dose-dependent relationship.
Okay, so quitting, even just cutting back, is a huge win for both our physical and mental health. What kind of improvements could someone expect to see after they quit smoking?
Studies have shown that quitting can lead to huge improvements in mood and anxiety. Often it can even be comparable to taking antidepressants.
Wow, that's incredible. And it's encouraging. It's not just about willpower. It's about seeking out support and finding the right strategies to break free from that addiction. Now, let's talk about a habit that's become, unfortunately, more and more prevalent in this digital age: social isolation.
Yeah, this is a big one, and it's something that we all need to be mindful of. I mean, humans are social creatures by nature, and not having those interactions can have a huge impact on our mental well-being.
It's almost like we're hardwired for connection. And when those connections are missing, our emotional immune system takes a hit, making us more vulnerable to mental health challenges.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the research totally supports that. Surveys consistently show that if you're feeling lonely or lacking emotional support, you experience higher levels of mental distress.
So what are some things that we can do to try and combat this,
Yeah.
especially in a world where it's becoming so much easier to isolate ourselves?
Well, I think it's all about being proactive. Schedule regular time to connect with your friends and family, even if it's just a phone call or a video chat. And think about joining groups or communities that share your interests, whether it's a book club, a fitness class, a volunteer organization.
Yeah, it's about creating those opportunities for genuine connection, building those social bonds that act as buffers against stress.
Exactly. And if you're feeling down, don't hesitate to reach out for support. Talk to a trusted friend, family member, or a mental health professional.
Sharing those feelings can often bring immense relief and perspective. Okay, we're already halfway through our list of habits. Let's dive into one that's, pretty much unavoidable in the digital world today: excessive screen time.
Yeah. Screen time, it's tricky. We're constantly being bombarded with information and stimulation, and it's so hard to escape. But the research is really clear. Excessive screen time is associated with increased anxiety, depression, and stress. And that's across all age groups.
But what's going on here? Is it the content that we're consuming, or is there something else at play?
It's a combination of factors. Spending too much time on screens can kind of crowd out those activities that are essential for mental well-being, like physical activity, sleep, face-to-face social interaction. And of course, let's not forget about the whole social comparison trap that comes with social media, where you're constantly being exposed to these idealized versions of other people.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in those carefully curated highlight reels and start to feel inadequate. So how do we navigate this whole digital dilemma? I mean, is it about like going off the grid completely?
Not necessarily. It's really about creating a more conscious and balanced relationship with technology. Maybe you try setting up some screen-free zones or activities, establishing some limits on social media use, and practicing mindfulness when you are using devices.
So, like, no phones at the dinner table or in the bedroom.
Exactly. Little changes like that can go a long way.
Okay, let's move on to another habit that I think is all too common in this fast-paced world: overworking.
Oh, yeah. The glorification of the hustle is definitely a concern. While it's great to be passionate about your work, consistently working long hours without enough rest or personal time can really take a toll on mental health.
So at what point does it become detrimental? Where do we draw that line?
Well, studies have found that people who are regularly working more than 55 hours a week have a way higher risk of developing depression and anxiety compared to those who have a more balanced work schedule.
So those late nights and weekend work sessions might not actually be as productive as we think, at least in the long run.
That's right. Overworking leads to less sleep, less exercise, less time for those things that really bring us joy and recharge our batteries.
So it's about setting those boundaries,
Yeah.
prioritizing self-care, and remembering that rest and rejuvenation, they're not luxuries, they're necessities.
Absolutely. And I think having a fulfilling life outside of work is so important. Spending time with loved ones, pursuing hobbies, engaging in activities that bring you joy.
Yeah, it's about that balance, isn't it? Not letting work consume our lives completely. Speaking of balance, let's move on to another habit that I think goes hand in hand with overworking, chronic stress without healthy coping mechanisms.
Ah, stress. It's a part of life, but it's how we manage it that really determines its impact on our well-being. If we're constantly under stress without any healthy outlets, our bodies are just stuck in that state of high alert, which can be really damaging over time.
It's almost like our stress response system is stuck in that on position.
Exactly. And all that chronic stress floods our brains with cortisol and these inflammatory chemicals that have been linked to both depression and anxiety.
So that feeling of being overwhelmed, constantly on edge, mentally exhausted, those are all signs that maybe we're just drowning in that chronic stress. So what are some things that we can do to actually manage this?
There are so many tools that we can add to our stress management toolkit. Mindfulness practices like meditation or deep breathing exercises are incredibly effective at calming the nervous system. Exercise is another amazing way to release tension and boost those feel-good endorphins.
And sometimes just talking about it can help,
Right, of
of
course.
course.
Connecting with trusted friends, family members, maybe even a therapist can provide emotional support and a fresh perspective. And don't forget, setting boundaries and learning to say no can be a powerful form of self-care.
Yeah, it's about protecting our time and energy, especially when we're feeling overwhelmed. Okay, so we've talked a lot about those external factors, but what about the internal ones? Let's move on to a habit that can be super sneaky and insidious: negative thinking patterns.
Ah, the inner critic, those nagging thoughts of self-doubt, pessimism, rumination, they can really create a vicious cycle of negativity.
Oh yeah, we can be our own worst enemies sometimes. And it's like those negative thoughts become so ingrained in our minds, shaping how we see ourselves in the world around us.
Absolutely. And the research backs it up. Habitual negative thinking, especially rumination and self-criticism, is a major risk factor for both depression and anxiety.
So those thoughts like, I'm not good enough, or I always mess things up, or even things will never get better, they're more than just like fleeting thoughts, right?
Yeah.
They can actually have a serious impact on our mental health.
Exactly. When we constantly dwell on problems or engage in that harsh self-talk, we're just reinforcing those feelings of hopelessness and inadequacy.
So how do we break free from those negative thought loops? I know it can be really hard to just like think positive when you're already feeling down.
You're right. It's not about denying or suppressing those thoughts, but more about learning to challenge and reframe them.
So instead of letting those thoughts run wild, we need to pause, examine them, and ask ourselves, is this really true? Or is there another way to look at this situation?
Exactly. And that's what we call cognitive restructuring, a technique that helps us identify and modify those distorted negative thought patterns.
And what about when we find ourselves stuck in that spiral of rumination? Just like replaying the same worries over and over in our heads.
That's where active distraction can be super helpful. Engaging in an activity that requires your full attention, like a puzzle, a creative project, or even just doing a simple chore, can help break that cycle.
So it's about taking our focus away from those negative thought patterns and giving our minds something else more constructive to focus on. What about cultivating gratitude? or practicing positive self-talk.
Well, those are powerful tools. Intentionally focusing on the good things in our lives and speaking to ourselves with kindness can gradually chip away at those negative thought patterns. It's like we're retraining our brains to see the world through a more balanced, more compassionate lens.
Okay, we're ready for habit number 11. Let's talk about one that I think a lot of us can relate to: procrastination and poor time management.
Oh, procrastination. That sneaky thief of time and productivity. But chronic procrastination, it can actually ripple out and affect our mental health. There are studies that have linked it to higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress.
So those all-nighters and last-minute scrambles, they're not just stressful in the moment, are they? They could be contributing to this longer-term pattern of, like, negativity and anxiety.
Exactly. Procrastination often leads to feeling overwhelmed, guilty, disappointed in ourselves, and all of that can just chip away at our self-esteem.
And those feelings, I should be further along or I'm not good enough, they can just feed right back into that cycle of negativity that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. Breaking free from procrastination. It isn't just about being more productive, it's about protecting our mental well-being. So what are some strategies for actually tackling this?
Because I know it can feel like such an uphill battle, especially when those avoidance urges are strong.
Structured planning can be really helpful. Instead of having these vague intentions, maybe break down your tasks into smaller, more manageable steps, and then set some realistic deadlines for each step.
It's almost like creating a roadmap for ourselves so we don't feel lost or overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. But what about those smaller tasks that we still just like put off?
Well, that's where something called the 2-minute rule can come in handy. So if a task takes less than 2 minutes to complete, do it right away. Answering a quick email, making a phone call, putting away a few dishes, just doing those things right away can prevent them from piling up and creating all that mental clutter.
Oh, I love that. It's about building momentum and preventing that feeling of being constantly behind. But what about when procrastination is kind of rooted in deeper feelings, like a fear of failure or perfectionism?
Well, in that case, self-awareness and addressing those underlying feelings is so important. If perfectionism is what's driving the procrastination, remind yourself that done is often better than perfect, especially for a first draft or an initial attempt at something.
It's about shifting our mindset from, I have to do this perfectly, to, like, I'm going to give this my best shot and learn along the way. Which brings us to our next habit: perfectionism.
Yeah, I mean, striving for excellence is a great thing, but when it turns into this relentless pursuit of flawlessness, that's when it can become a major source of stress and unhappiness.
It's about that constant pressure to meet impossible standards and just, the feeling that nothing is ever good enough no matter how hard you try.
Exactly. And that type of what we call maladaptive perfectionism is strongly linked to higher levels of both depression and anxiety.
So it's not just about, like, being a high achiever. It's about that underlying fear of failure,
Yeah.
that harsh self-criticism that can really erode self-esteem
Yeah.
and just kind of suck the joy out of our accomplishments.
You got it. Perfectionists often get fixated on mistakes and shortcomings, which can lead to more procrastination, more anxiety, and just a sense of never being satisfied.
It's like they're on this treadmill of self-imposed pressure, never quite reaching that finish line of self-acceptance. So how do we break free from that? I mean, I imagine it's not about just like abandoning our standards completely.
Right, of course not. But it is about setting realistic goals, goals that are flexible, and also embracing the idea that sometimes good enough is good enough.
So instead of striving for this unattainable ideal, we're focusing on progress, effort, and celebrating those little wins along the way.
Exactly. And practice self-compassion. Treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a friend.
Okay, let's move on to a habit that I think can really impact our overall sense of well-being: lack of purpose or meaning in life.
Yeah, this can be a tough one. It really touches on those deep values and aspirations. When we're feeling adrift, unsure of what we're working towards, it can lead to this feeling of emptiness, disillusionment.
It's almost like we're missing that compass that guides our journey, that sense of direction that gives our lives meaning.
Yeah. And the research shows that this lack of purpose, it's actually associated with higher rates of depression and anxiety, particularly in young adults.
Wow. So it's not just a philosophical question, it's actually a matter of mental health. So what are some things that we can do to cultivate a sense of purpose?
I think it really begins with self-reflection. What matters most to you? What are the activities or the principles that make you feel fulfilled, make you feel energized.
So it's about trying to identify those core values, those guiding principles
Yeah.
that shape how we want to live our lives.
Yeah, and once you kind of have a better understanding of your values, you can start setting small, purposeful goals that are actually in line with those values. And it doesn't have to be about this grand life mission. It can just be about taking small steps in a direction that feels meaningful.
And oftentimes those small steps can lead to bigger things, right?
Right? Totally. And remember, connecting to something larger than ourselves can also bring purpose into our lives, whether that's getting involved in our community, exploring spirituality, contributing to a cause.
It's about finding those things that make us feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves.
Good. Hmm.
Okay, moving on. This next habit is one that I personally struggle with sometimes. Staying indoors all the time.
Yeah, this is often called nature deficit, and the research on it is fascinating. Sunlight, fresh air, green spaces, they actually have a profound impact on our mood.
It's like nature has this innate ability to just soothe our minds and restore our balance.
It really does. So sunlight, it helps to regulate our circadian rhythms, and it also boosts our vitamin D levels, both of which are super important for mood regulation. And then being in nature also reduces those stress hormones. And guess what? It increases those feel-good neurotransmitters.
So even if we're living in urban environments, just finding those little pockets of nature and incorporating them into our routines can make a big difference.
Exactly. Even small doses of nature can have a positive impact. And if getting outside really isn't an option, maybe try bringing a bit of nature indoors. Houseplants, natural light.
It's all about finding those ways to connect with nature no matter where we are. Okay, shifting gears to a habit that's become increasingly common in this digital age, especially during times of uncertainty, doom scrolling, those negative news stories.
Oh, we've all been there. It's so easy to get sucked into that vortex of negativity, especially with 247 news and this constant stream of information on social media.
And it can feel really overwhelming, like the world is falling apart. But how does this actually impact our mental well-being?
When we are constantly consuming negative news, it puts our brains into this state of high alert, which can lead to a lot more anxiety and even a distorted view of what's really happening in the world.
It's like we're just bombarding our minds with the constant stream of negativity, making it super hard to see the good.
That's right. And the research shows that doom scrolling is linked to lower overall well-being and life satisfaction.
Okay, so it's not about being uninformed. It's about finding that balance between staying informed and, protecting our mental health.
Exactly. So maybe set some limits on your news intake. Choose specific times during the day to check the headlines, and make sure you're balancing those negative news stories with some positive or uplifting content.
So maybe instead of ending the day scrolling through the latest headlines, we opt for a book, a funny video, or a good conversation with someone we love.
That's a great idea. Speaking of social media, let's talk about a habit that often goes along with doom scrolling: constantly comparing ourselves to others.
Ugh, the comparison game. It's way too easy to fall into that trap, especially when we're constantly being shown images of people who seem to have it all. The perfect job, the perfect relationship, the perfect life.
And the more we engage in those comparisons where we're always looking up, the worse we tend to feel about ourselves. It can really hurt our self-esteem.
So how do we break free from this cycle? It's not about becoming completely oblivious to other people, is it?
No, not at all. It's about shifting our focus inward and really recognizing our own inherent worth, practicing gratitude for what we have, celebrating our own accomplishments, and reframing those comparisons as potential sources of inspiration rather than benchmarks for our worth.
So instead of focusing on what we're lacking, we're choosing to appreciate our own unique strengths and all the things that have brought us to where we are today.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that what we see on social media is often a carefully curated highlight reel. It's not the whole story.
Okay, let's move on to a habit that I think is just essential for a well-rounded life: making time for hobbies and leisure activities.
The power of play. It's often overlooked, but research shows that engaging in enjoyable leisure activities is linked to better mental health and higher life satisfaction.
I know that for me, when I make time for those things that I really enjoy, whether it's painting or hiking or just reading a good book, I feel so much more balanced, more energized.
And there are so many benefits to having hobbies. They provide a break from daily stressors, the sense of accomplishment, opportunities for creativity and learning, and often they give us a chance to connect with other people who share those interests.
So whether it's painting, playing music, gardening, dancing, whatever brings you joy, make time for it. Okay, now it's time to talk about a sensitive but really important topic: poor financial habits and the toll they can take on our mental well-being.
Yeah. Money matters can be a huge source of stress and anxiety, especially when we're dealing with debt or facing financial uncertainty. It can really feel like those worries are always in the back of our minds, making it so hard to relax and just enjoy life.
And it's like those money worries create this constant background hum of stress, making it harder to just relax and enjoy life.
You're so right. And the research shows a very clear link between financial strain and higher rates of depression and anxiety. And it becomes this vicious cycle because the stress of having financial problems can make it even harder to make those good financial decisions.
So where do we even begin to try and address this? Because it can feel so overwhelming.
Well, it starts with just being aware. Take some time to really understand your financial situation. Create a budget, track your spending, see if there are areas where you can cut back or make some adjustments. Knowledge is power, and even small changes can make a huge difference over time.
It's about taking those first steps to regain that sense of control.
Exactly. And if debt is a major source of stress for you, explore different strategies for tackling it, like the snowball or avalanche methods. And don't be afraid to seek guidance from a financial advisor if you need it.
Okay, moving on to our penultimate habit, clutter and disorganization. This might seem like a small thing, but I know I personally feel so much more at peace when my surroundings are tidy and organized.
And there's a scientific reason for that. Research has shown that living in a cluttered environment can actually contribute to cognitive overload, increased stress hormones, and just that feeling of being overwhelmed. It's like our brains are just being bombarded with all this visual noise, making it hard to relax and focus.
So that feeling of being frazzled and overwhelmed when our surroundings are a mess, it's not just in our heads.
Right. Creating a more organized space can do so much for our mental well-being.
So for those of us who struggle with clutter, any tips for getting started?
Start small. Instead of trying to tackle everything at once, choose one area, like a drawer, a shelf, and declutter it completely. Then move on to the next area. Breaking it down into smaller steps can make the task feel way less daunting.
And once we've decluttered, how do we stay organized?
Create systems that work for you. Give everything a place. Use labels, make it super easy to put things back where they belong. The trick is to find what works for you and what makes organization feel less like a chore.
And finally, let's talk about a habit that can be particularly tough, but it's so important for our emotional well-being, bottling up our emotions.
Yes. This is something that we all do sometimes, especially when we're afraid of being judged or burdening other people. But the research shows that suppressing our emotions can actually do more harm than good in the long run.
It's like those unexpressed emotions just keep building up inside us, creating all this tension and stress.
That's it. And it's important to remember, emotions are meant to be felt. They're part of being human. Bottling them up just makes them more intense.
So how do we actually learn to express our emotions in a healthy way? Because it can be scary to open up, especially if we're not used to it.
It all starts with creating a safe space for ourselves. Acknowledge those feelings without any judgment. Let yourself feel them fully. And if you're comfortable, consider sharing them with someone that you trust. Maybe a friend, family member, therapist, even a support group.
It's about finding those people who can just hold space for us, who can listen without judgment and offer support without trying to fix us.
You got it. And remember, expressing emotions doesn't always have to involve talking about them. You can find healthy outlets that work for you, whether it's physical activity, something creative, spending time in nature, or anything else that feels right. Yeah, it's like we're trying to push all those feelings under the rug, but they just keep piling up and create this like invisible weight that we're carrying around.
Yeah.
And, the research actually shows that emotion suppression is linked to depression. When we're always pushing down those difficult emotions, they don't just magically go away. They can actually make that internal stress even worse and even manifest as physical symptoms.
Oh, wow. So things like headaches, muscle tension, digestive issues, all that stuff, those could actually be signs that we're not dealing with our emotions in a healthy way.
Exactly. And if we don't reach out for support, whether it's from friends, family, or, mental health professionals, we can end up feeling even more isolated and overwhelmed.
It's like we're trying to weather those emotional storms all alone,
Mm-hmm.
without a life raft or a compass. So how do we break free from this pattern of just bottling everything up? Because I know it can be so hard to open up, especially if we've been taught that showing vulnerability is a weakness.
Yeah, you're right. It takes a lot of courage, but it's so important for our emotional well-being. I think even just acknowledging those feelings to yourself is a good first step. Name them, maybe write them down, or even just allow yourself to feel them without any judgment.
So it's about creating that safe space within ourselves to actually acknowledge and process those emotions instead of trying to ignore them or pretend that they're not there.
Exactly. And once you feel a little more comfortable with those feelings, consider sharing them with somebody that you trust. Could be a friend, a family member, a therapist, or maybe even a support group.
Yeah, it's about finding those people who can just listen without judging us, offer support without trying to fix us or give us unsolicited advice.
You got it. And, expressing emotions doesn't always have to be about talking. Find healthy outlets that work for you, whether it's physical activity, something creative, spending time in nature.
It's about finding those channels that allow us to release those pent-up emotions in a way that feels safe and actually productive. Okay, that was number 20. We've officially covered all 20 everyday habits that could be secretly affecting our happiness.
And now that we've kind of shined a light on them, we can start to make those small adjustments that can really lead to some big changes in our overall well-being.
Yeah, it's not about being perfect or making these drastic changes overnight. It's about those consistent small steps that can, over time, create this ripple effect of positive change.
And remember, everyone's journey is different. What works for one person might not work for another. So it's important to experiment, be patient with yourself, and celebrate those small victories along the way.
Absolutely. So now that you've heard about these 20 habits, we want you to take a moment to reflect. Which one really stood out to you? What's one small change that you're willing to try this week to maybe shift that balance towards a happier you? Remember, even the tiniest changes can create a huge ripple effect. Until next time, stay curious, stay mindful, and keep diving deep.
It really is. It's like we're trapped in this cycle of always striving and never quite feeling like we're good enough, but breaking free from that is definitely
Oh,
possible.
okay. So how do we actually start to loosen perfectionism's grip? I mean, I'm guessing it's not about just lowering our standards altogether.
No, not at all. It's about finding a healthier approach. So instead of always aiming for flawless, what if we focused on just setting realistic goals, goals that are challenging but still achievable?
That makes a lot of sense. And maybe instead of beating ourselves up over every little mistake, we can start viewing them as opportunities to learn and grow.
Right. Mistakes are going to happen,
Right.
and they can actually be these valuable stepping stones along our path. Embracing that mindset can take a lot of pressure off.
And maybe, just maybe, we can actually find some enjoyment in the process.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit to a habit that can have some pretty huge implications for our overall sense of well-being: a lack of purpose or meaning in life.
This one feels big. It's about figuring out what really matters to us, right? What gives our lives that sense of direction and motivation.
That's exactly it. And the research shows that this lack of purpose is linked to higher rates of depression and anxiety, especially in young adults.
So it's not just an existential crisis. It can really impact our mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And while finding our purpose can seem daunting, it doesn't have to be about finding some big, grand life mission. It can be as simple as identifying what brings us joy, what feels aligned with our values, and then taking those small steps in that direction.
So maybe it's about exploring different interests, volunteering, or just taking some time to reflect on what makes us feel alive.
Exactly. And oftentimes those small steps can actually lead us to some much bigger discoveries. We start to notice connections, opportunities, and a sense of purpose kind of emerges naturally from there.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired. Now, on to a habit that I find so incredibly rejuvenating,
Yeah.
spending time in nature.
Yeah. A lot of people call this nature deficit. And it's something we're seeing more and more as more people live in urban areas. But the research is clear. Spending time in nature is so beneficial for our mental health.
I know that I personally always feel more grounded and at peace after I go for a walk in the woods, or even just sit in a park for a little while.
There's a real scientific reason for that. Sunlight helps regulate our circadian rhythms and boost our vitamin D levels, which both play a part in mood regulation. Being in nature also reduces those pesky stress hormones. And you guessed it, it increases those feel-good neurotransmitters.
So it's not just about enjoying the scenery. Our brains and bodies actually function better when we're spending time in nature.
Exactly. And even if you live in a city, there are often pockets of nature you can find: parks, gardens, even just a tree-lined street. Those little doses of nature can make a big difference.
And if we can't get outside, there's always the option of bringing nature indoors. Plants, natural light.
Absolutely. Okay, let's address a habit that's gotten super tempting in this digital age: doom scrolling through all the negative news.
Oh man, This is a tough one.
Yeah.
It's so easy to fall into that vortex of negativity, especially with the 24/7 news cycle and all the information that's constantly flowing on social media.
It's understandable, but if we're constantly consuming those negative news stories, it can keep our brains in that state of high alert, which just leads to more anxiety and can make us see the world in a distorted way. Research has actually linked doom scrolling to lower overall well-being.
So it's not about just ignoring what's happening in the world. It's about finding a healthy balance, right?
Exactly. Maybe you set some limits on how much news you consume. You could even pick specific times during the day when you'll check the headlines. And make sure to balance it out with some positive and uplifting content.
So maybe instead of winding down for the night scrolling through the headlines, we opt for a good book, a funny video, or a conversation with someone we love.
Now let's talk about a habit that goes hand in hand with all that social media use and can fuel feelings of inadequacy: constant social comparison.
Oh yeah, the comparison trap. It's so easy to get caught up in that, especially when we're surrounded by these images of people who seem to have it all figured out, the perfect job, relationship, life, the whole nine yards.
And the more we compare ourselves to those people, those upward comparisons, the worse we tend to feel. It can really damage our self-esteem.
So how do we break free from this cycle? I mean, it's not about just tuning out the rest of the world, is it? Yeah.
No, it's about shifting that focus inward and recognizing our own worth. Practice gratitude. Celebrate your own wins. And try to reframe those comparisons as potential sources of inspiration instead of ways to measure your own worth.
So instead of dwelling on what we don't have, we can appreciate our own unique strengths and all the things that have gotten us to this point.
Exactly. And remember, what we see on social media, it's usually just a highlight reel. It's not the whole picture.
Okay, let's move on to a habit that's so important for a well-rounded life. Making time for hobbies and those leisure activities.
The power of play. It's seriously underestimated. Research shows that doing those fun things, those leisure activities that you enjoy, they're linked to better mental health and just higher life satisfaction.
I know for me, when I actually make time for the things that light me up, whether it's painting, hiking, reading a good book, I just feel so much more balanced and energized overall.
And the benefits are huge. Hobbies help us take a break from all those stressors. They give us that sense of accomplishment, opportunities to be creative and learn new things, and a lot of times they give us a chance to connect with people who have similar interests.
So whether you like to paint, play music, garden, dance, whatever it is that brings you joy, make time for it. Okay, now it's time to discuss a sensitive but super important topic. Poor financial habits and how they can impact our mental well-being.
Yeah, money matters can be incredibly stressful, especially if you're in debt or facing financial uncertainty. It can feel like those worries are always there, looming in the background, making it really hard to relax and enjoy life.
It's true. It's like those money worries are constantly there, like a hum in the background.
And you know what? Research has shown a strong link between financial strain and higher rates of depression and anxiety. And then, unfortunately, it can turn into a vicious cycle because that stress and anxiety make it even harder to make good financial decisions.
So where do we even start to address this? It can feel so overwhelming.
Well, first, just become aware. Take a look at your finances. Put together a budget, see where your money's going, and figure out if there are any areas where you can cut back or adjust things. Even small changes can make a huge difference.
It's about taking those first steps to feel more in control.
Exactly. And if debt is a major source of stress for you, look into different ways to manage it. There's the snowball method, the avalanche method, and if you need help, don't hesitate to reach out to a financial advisor.
Okay, we're at our second to last habit now. Clutter and disorganization. It might seem like a small thing, but I personally know that I feel much more peaceful and calm when my surroundings are tidy and organized.
And there's science to back that up. Research actually shows that living in a cluttered environment can lead to cognitive overload, it can increase your stress hormones, and it can just make you feel overwhelmed. It's like our poor brains are constantly bombarded with all this visual noise, which makes it really hard to relax and focus.
So that feeling of being frazzled and completely overwhelmed when our surroundings are messy, that's not just in our heads.
Nope. Creating a more organized space can really do wonders for our mental well-being.
Okay, so any tips for people like me who struggle with keeping things tidy?
Start small. Instead of trying to do everything at once, just pick one area, maybe a drawer or a shelf, declutter it completely, and then move on to the next area. Breaking it down into smaller steps makes the whole thing way less daunting.
That's a good strategy. And then once we've decluttered, how do we actually stay organized?
Find systems that work for you. Give everything a designated spot. Use labels. Make it easy to put things away. The key is to find something that you can maintain without feeling like it's a chore.
And finally, we've reached our last habit for today. It can be a tough one, but it's so important for our emotional well-being, bottling up our emotions.
Oh, yes. We all do this from time to time, especially when we're worried about being judged or we don't want to burden other people with their problems. But research has shown that holding all those emotions in can be really harmful over time.
It's like those unexpressed emotions just keep building up inside of us, creating tension and stress.
Exactly. And remember, it's okay to feel your emotions. They're a part of life. Trying to bottle them up just makes them even stronger.
So how do we learn to express those emotions in a healthy way? I mean, it can be scary to open up, especially if we're not used to it.
Well, I think it starts with creating that safe space for ourselves. Acknowledge those feelings, without judgment. Let yourself feel them. And if it feels okay, think about sharing them with someone you trust. It could be a friend, family member, therapist, support group.
Yeah, it's about finding those people who can just be there for us, listen without judgment, and just offer support without trying to fix anything.
Absolutely. And remember, expressing your emotions doesn't always have to be about talking about them. Find those healthy outlets that work for you, whether it's physical activity, being creative, spending time outdoors, anything that feels good and right to you.
Well, there you have it. We've explored 20 everyday habits that could be secretly affecting your happiness. And most importantly, we've discussed ways to start shifting those habits toward a more positive path.
Remember, it's not about being perfect, it's about making progress. Those small changes, if you do them consistently, they can have a huge impact on our well-being. And remember, everyone's different. What works for one person may not work for someone else. So it's about finding what feels right for you and what fits into your own life.
That's so important. So as you go through the week, think about these 20 habits.
Hmm?
Which one really resonates with you? What's one small change that you could try maybe today to start moving in a direction that feels better, feels more aligned with your values and your vision for a happier, healthier life?
Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.